Welcome to Rauta's black metal crash course through Norway of 1990s, including some of the bands from the 80s, as some of people you might know. Why this is worth mentioning is that this episode 12 actually features one of the bands that were founded in the 80s, even though very much a 1990s band, for many reasons which we'll address very soon. The bands in question today are Obtain, Enslavement, Limbonic Art and Odium. So these names being dropped out right now means obviously we're talking about more symphonic elements of black metal or symphonic style of Norwegian black metal. Since we're going in this case from older to the newer ones, we'll start with Obtain Enslavement, which in fact already started in 1989, which is in fact before a lot of these more classic Norwegian bands existed. I mean, whether we're talking about bands like Immortal, Enslaved, or whatever, most of those bands existed, didn't exist in the 80s, that is, but started in 1990s, even though there were bands from the death metal side of things from the 80s or around the same age roughly. But since we're focusing here on black metal, not death metal coming from Norway, it's kind of fair to point out that Obtain Enslavement was there with this kind of a moniker even before a lot of those names, which is kind of curious considering that they are not one of the cornerstone bands. I mean, apart from Mayhem and Dark Throne, obviously, most of the bands didn't really do anything in the 80s. More or less, most Norwegian black metal bands are, of course, from the 1990s. But Obtain Enslavement were there, and they already did a couple of demos very early 1990s, 1992, 1993, which puts them once again before a lot of other bands could even touch their instruments and all that stuff. It's kind of curious considering that this band only did 4 albums and basically ceased to exist after the start of the new millennium. Whereas a lot of bands basically were starting their stuff around late 90s or around 2000s. For example, a band called 1349. So that is that. But here we are talking about Obtain Enslavement, obviously. So this is a curious band. I already featured this a while back. Was already like a year or two ago when I went through the whole discography. And then I was basically giving my ranking for the band. Now I know this band clearly divides people into two. Those who really worship their symphonic black metal stuff, which is way overboard for compared to a lot of other bands. And then there are people like me who are like, no, too cheesy, too much like overboard and all that stuff. But be it as may, I'm not gonna do the ranking this time so much in detail as with the previous video, just going through why or why not you should be checking out this band as being part of the 1990s black metal movement. Now, as you might already have noticed while I'm talking here, this band indeed started with death metal, so not that different from a lot of those other parts where they were talking Burzum, Dark Throne, you know, Immortal, stuff like that, which already did death metal before starting to do black metal. Some bands changed the name or started like basically put the past behind it, whether we're talking about Hades or Immortal and stuff like that. They just changed the name and restarted, whereas Dark Throne then again of course did death metal before moving on to black metal. Obtain Enslavement is a little bit different, but kind of similar to Dark Throne in that started with death metal, kept the name, and then started doing black metal. So for example, when you're talking about Centuries of Sorrow, which came as late as 1994, you will clearly hear the death metal past being there present. It was only until 1997 with Witchcraft and followed by Soul Blight a year later that it was, you know, really tapping into the world of black metal. But not any kind of black metal, more symphonic than most Norwegian bands or most black metal bands around the world ever did. That is, compared to, say, Emperor, which I guess in a way would be the closest one in terms of style, coming still from Norway, this went even further with their style of like going really cheesy, but also really bombastic stuff with their symphonic black metal. I mean, it's full of like those classic inspired stuff, but the execution is not very good in my opinion. But this is about opinions and possibly more on the ranking video side rather than this one. Why this is worth mentioning is that Obtain Enslavement was one of the very few bands that actually did this kind of symphonic black metal, whereas a lot of bands either went really raw style, or then just going more melodic style, or somewhere between, or even Viking metal style, implying some kind of a folkier elements, including that, etc. So Obtain Enslavement was actually, pioneering in a way their own style. Of course, Emperor was their first, but in my opinion, Obtain Enslavement took it further. Now, whether or not this is a good thing or just like wrong, well, that's of course a question that everybody has to answer for themselves. It depends. I know a lot of fans, well, not a lot, but I know a few people who absolutely worship the mid-era Obtain Enslavement for the work with witchcraft and soul blight. So I kind of guess it, they just pushed the right buttons, find their own niche and marginal audience, and did whatever they did. Well, they changed the style with the Shepherd and the Hounds of Hell, which in my opinion is their best work, but that's another story, because then they just ceased to exist and went onwards. Now, if you're looking for similar artists, for example here in Metal Archives, obviously you will see names like Emperor, Limbonic Art and Odium mentioned for a rather obvious reason, and two of those bands are for that reason in this video. Why Emperor? Not because that was already mentioned in one of the early videos, being one of the biggest Norwegian bands. So if you're looking reasons why or why not to check this band out, well, you have it all here. Emperor, Limbonic Art and Odium. Those are the closest things from Norway to this particular band, with only 4 albums in, and we could safely say like 3 of them are black metal ones. Was an interesting band and would have been cool to see where they went after the 4th album, but unfortunately I don't see very likely that we will ever see a successor to that. But who knows, comebacks are real and all that stuff. Then we move to Limbonic Art, which is not from Bergen nor Oslo, but Sandefjord, which is not exactly of these two rivaling cities from Norway, which of course being one of the bigger ones, well, the biggest ones from Norway, of course meant that a lot of bands were focusing on those cities. But Limbonic Art came from a little bit different area, and of course, as such, partially anyway, came with a little bit different thing. Now obviously nowadays it's a only one-man band, been quite for some time, but I guess the classic lineup for Limbonic Art is where you had Morpheus and Demon Diamond. And now there were a few other people, some of them are unfortunately dead already, but I guess the classic lineup would be indeed these two guys. Why classic? Because 1996, when Moon in the Scorpio came out, it made certain kind of waves. Suddenly it was this symphonic black metal, but more keyboard driven than the other bands. I mean, what is still audible, if you're listening to their debut album after the demos and all that stuff, you will hear it's all very much done with keyboards, them leading the way, and guitars are more in the background. Now on top of that you also have this drum machine, which is either obnoxious, purely annoying, or just something different. Now it totally depends from which kind of background you come from, which kind of black metal you're looking for. If you're more like guitar driven black metal fan or metal fan to begin with, then you might just find Limbonic Art too weird. That's what I feel mostly about Limbonic Art, but there are a couple of exceptions to that. But if you are like, hey, keyboards are the coolest instruments, even cooler than guitars or drums or whatever, then Limbonic Art might be your cup of tea. Now the thing here is, in 1996 when Moon the Scorpio was released, in my opinion it was different. I didn't hear it back in 1996, but maybe a couple of years later, because I think it was late 1990s when I heard it, because in Appearance, Dementia was quite soon there as well. And he obviously started figuring out what is this band all about, blah blah blah. And it was evident that this band used keyboards way more than other bands. You could basically combine a bunch of other bands and still they would be second compared to Limbonic Art, whatever they were doing with keyboards. Now whether or not this is a cool thing, once again depends on your personal opinions and what kind of stuff you favor. In Appearance Dementia, the band took it even further, adding keyboards, putting guitars more on the background, and as such becoming less metal in a way. I mean, you had drum machine, you had the keyboards, and the style was basically symphonic black metal. But how metallic can you really be if you just remove guitars out of equation? It's not like they removed it, but if you listen to it, you will figure it out. The bass, the guitars, they're not really that audible compared to the keyboards, whatever is happening. In my opinion, there's a big dive from Moon in the Scorpio into Apparence Dimension and even Epitome of Illusions. But they started bringing guitars forth later on. And that's where, curiously enough, it happens. The style kind of changes, yet at the same time it keeps the same drum machine and still lots of keyboards. And eventually it would mean the other important person in the band left the band. So what happened here is an interesting change, in my opinion. Ad Noctum, The Dynasty of Death, is one of the best albums by Limbonic Art, with Moon in the Scorpio debut album. But after that, it kind of started changing, adding more guitars on the front, putting or pushing more keyboards on the back, maybe basically balancing things out. So more guitars were laid out and became more typical black metal band, but in the essence also losing some of the originality with the music. Now, Limbonic Art has always been kind of sticking to their guns, staying true to their original style, and can't really blame it. But I can say, for that reason, it's not really my cup of tea. Because all of these albums always sticking to the very fact. Keyboards first, guitars second, drum machine somewhere in the middle maybe. My point here is, it's so unmetallic in a way, because of drum machine, because of, you know, guitars being on the background versus keyboards, that it's just something different. For some people it's really, really a blessing, and some people will of course like Limbonic Art being something different. But people who, you know, grew up with thrash metal, heavy metal, or death metal for fuck's sake, might really feel like this is kind of awkward, because it's so keyboard driven and it's kind of odd. It's given, it's part of their DNA, it's part of the originality, it's part of the reason why the band is loved in the first place. But it's just kind of a bizarre in a way. Now, in my opinion, they never made really, really good albums. There are a couple of better albums, which I mentioned, Moon in the Scorpio and Ad Noctum, but the rest are more like fluctuating between mediocrity and decent. But this is just my take. It's definitely different kind of take of black metal, even symphonic black metal if you will. And it depends totally, once again, whether or not you put a lot of emphasis on guitars or not. So it's an interesting band, and always doing their own style, which is something that I can totally respect. But it's not for everybody. And now it's more like this one-man band, putting them back to bedroom black metal box. So hard to recommend this to a bigger audience, even if you are fanatic of Norwegian black metal. Now, if you have to pick up the best of the early works of Limbonic Art, or figuring out where to start listening to this one in case you have missed it, I would say start in chronological order, especially Moon in the Scorpio being on the front, because that's probably the most meaningful album by Limbonic Art ever made. The rest are not bad, of course, but it's not really adding that much something new to the whole style they created back in the mid-90s. Which leads us to the last one, the pile, and also the one with the shortest discography here. It's kind of safe to say Odium at this point is one-hit wonder. Starting as a side project of Murkskog and what have you, you will figure it out once you take a look here. It was basically, you know, a real band back in the days. You had a real lineup, that's why there is this photo, 5 people and all. But I mean, for a long time it has been only basically one member, with now some live members in the stuff. Anyway, they made one album, 1998, called The Sad Realm of the Star, which is actually pretty good of an album. I mean, it's a symphonic black metal, not very original. It's very much like nodding towards Ember and the like. And once again, if you open the similar artist tab here on, you know, Metal Archives, you will see Limbonic Art and Emperor mentioned first. I mean, it's kind of given, and also that Obtain Enslavement. However, even though there are lots of keyboards on Sad Realm of the Stars, this is, in my opinion, closer to Ember than Limbonic Art, because it actually sounds more metallic than, say, Limbonic Art. Also, a lot of these keyboard ideas, these symphonic structures, are closer to what Ember is doing, which is something that I think basically Odium took to pass. I mean, imagine Ember like, okay, we're gonna just, you know, throw you the ball. After Night's at Eclipse, we're gone a different direction with Anthems and the albums that followed. And Odium is like, okay, I'm gonna catch it. I'm gonna, you know, throw it through the hoop. I'm gonna take your symphonic black metal to the way you intended with in the Night's at Eclipse and whatever was there before that, like the EP material and all that stuff. So Ember went into more avant-garde-ish directions and more artistic ways, exploring new territories with Prometheus and IX Equilibrium or Ninth Equilibrium and whatever. And Odium was, in my opinion, supposed to keep that kind of a flame going on. Unfortunately, never happened. Maybe because of Murukskog, maybe something else, but the band ceased to exist in 2001. And that was when the latest release, the single, was released. Now, Odium has been back for live performances on all since 2018. I got to see them play at latest Inferno, and they played a good show. The new lineup is wonderful, and they sound like very, very timeless. Like as if you're at the same time in 2023 and back in the late 90s. Very, very cool to see if Odium actually comes back with some new recordings. If you've seen my Odium interview, they will explain that there is actually material being done and all. So maybe someday there will be a successor to this particular album. But so far it's the only one, and I think it's worth giving a shot. It's pretty good of an album and kind of a showcases the potential the band already had back in the late 90s. It would have been cool to see where the band would have gone, evolved and so forth, if only it didn't split up. So 3 different bands from the symphonic world of black metal from Norway from the 90s. Pretty interesting take, but also quite different when compared to, say, bands like Gorgoroth, Mayhem, what have you, which never even touched the slightest of the world of symphonic black metal, unlike Dimmu Borgir, Ember, and so forth. These are not for everybody, but those who like keyboard-infused black metal or even keyboard-driven black metal will find this band all interesting, even if you have skipped them back in the days. Now off you go and enjoy. I will link some of the stuff here, like included the Odium interview, so enjoy your time with them and explore these bands if you haven't done it so far. Take care.